Thank you. First, let me say it's a true honor to be here, and I really want to commend Tucson and the Daily Star and the university for this unbelievable event. I mean, I've spent all day here walking around, and the number of people that have come out, the interest in reading and literature just warms my heart, and it's great to see the young people out here especially. I know many of us who are a little more senior would obviously come, but to see so many young people interested in books and reading and authors and lectures, I think says something. This book, Leading the Charge, came about almost unintentionally. Several years ago, I wrote a book called The Battle for Peace, and it was a book about how the world was changing around us ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, sort of a confluence of things, a perfect storm. The Soviet Union collapsing, changing the power structure, the rise of globalization, the information age, mass migrations of people now seeking greater opportunity, and a whole set of things that I watched for my last 10 years in the military and then 10 years out in the business world, academia, and other places. And it struck me when I wrote that book that we weren't getting it, that the world is changing so drastically and in such major ways, becoming much more complex, complicated, that we're missing this and we're still operating under the old ways and systems and organizations. In the course of going around on the book tour for that book with audiences like yours, and in the Q&A periods, I would get questions and comments about leadership. And it struck me because of the number and the frequency of those kinds of comments and questions. And the gist of what people were saying is that it's not just a matter of the world changing and our environment changing. Our leaders are failing us. They don't get it. And I walked away from the weeks of that book tour saying, you know, this has been impressive by just the nature and the consistency of those comments, that I wanted to see if that really was more than just the anecdotal information I was picking up. Do people really feel that way? Is there a sense that there's a crisis in leadership? So like a good writer, you research everything. I went online to a number of organizations that do leadership surveys and have for years, Harvard University, a number of others, that sort of take the pulse of people, not only in the United States, but globally, about their views and feelings about leadership in every aspect of society. And frankly, I was shocked at what I found. And this was late 2008. But from 2008 on back to, say, the beginning of the century, continuously there's been a rise in the percentage of people that feel we have a crisis of leadership. In 2008, 80% of Americans polled said we have a crisis in leadership. And not just in political leadership or where you might expect that events might drive that sort of opinion, but across the board. As I delved further into and drilled down into the research, when they were asked about different aspects of society, the clergy, business leaders and military leaders and all others, in 2008, not one group achieved higher than 50% approval rating. And that particularly struck me personally because it was the first year that military leaders dropped below that percentage. And so I went to look at how globally people felt about leadership. Is this just a United States, American phenomenon, or is this the way people feel around the world? In several of the surveys that I found that not one political head of state had achieved above 50% approval rating by his or her constituents, their people. And so to me, there was a clear indication that there is a sense, if not a factual realization, that leaders are failing us. Why? I wanted to understand what is happening. We have created such phenomenal leaders in the world, in our own nation, in the past, in almost every field. So why is this sense out there? And not everybody could be failing. I mean, obviously there are leaders that are making it. And I particularly wanted to look in areas where the vast majority of leadership was rated very low. Why do you have the one standout that seems to go against the tide and people feel are strong leaders? What makes them different? So the gist of the book was about my views or observations as to what makes good leaders today and why other leaders are failing. And I broke it down into about 11 areas. My partner on the book, Tony Colts, about halfway through, said, since for half a century you've been a supposed leader, why don't you throw a few of your views in here too? So I took him up on it, and so I salted it a little bit with my own personal views or experiences on leadership, good and bad, trial and error over half a century. That particular part of it made me think about leadership in another way. At the same time all this was going on, I was asked to teach a course at Duke University at their Sanford Leadership Center, so I was preparing for the course. And I decided to look at how I was trained, if you will, or educated to be a leader. Not just the experiences, but what did my service, the military, do to train and prepare me? Did it work or didn't it work? What did I find out? And it caused me to look at leadership development programs in business. I'm the chairman of a board of a major company, and we have a leadership program, and I've been involved in several others. And how do we develop leaders now? And the other aspect I wanted to look at, something very strange that struck me because of something I read, the history of leadership. You know, it's something we don't think about, but we really decided we needed to create leaders from the masses about the beginning of the last century. If you think about history, that's about the time monarchies and dictators and other things were beginning to fade from most of the world, certainly not everywhere. But about the beginning of the 20th century, we realized if you're democratic, you have representative government, if everybody's going to be given a fair chance and you can rise in the ranks, then obviously we have to figure a way to train you. It's not bloodline. It's not a class of elites. And so what did we do about that? I mean, clearly you could look at business and industry, you could look at military and other large institutions and their approach. And the approach was interesting. In the beginning of the century, we felt if you build a good character, you build a good leader. If you looked at our training early on, you would see that it was character building to build leaders. It was the Boy Scout traits, clean, reverent, obedient. I remember when I first joined the military that I got a card that had all the traits of a good leader. I had to memorize those traits, carry it around with me. You know, and there's a platoon sergeant that will make sure you memorize all that or else. But this idea of building good character was the first approach to leadership. And certainly there was nothing wrong with that. We want good people to be leaders. And we found out about several decades into the century, there's more to it. We began to educate leaders. And we found out toward the end of the century, there's a third component, and maybe the most important, and that's giving potential leaders experience. You know, you look at the military, and those of you that served in the military, you know that every couple of years we have to pack up and move. You're going to have a different experience, a different assignment. If you're promoted, you're going to go to a different position. And the purpose of all that is to give you a variety and a breadth of experiences to develop you or the few that we're going to keep into that senior leadership mode. Business does that now. I can tell you in my company, we have an extensive leadership program which is built progressively from the junior leaders to the mid-level leaders to the senior leaders. And we actually rotate them around. We have rotational positions in marketing, in finance, where we try to give them that wide breadth of experience. One of the things that we don't want to see is what we call tall, thin people. That isn't an anatomical criticism. It's people that come and do well in one area, like an engineer, and you see potential in that person that he or she could be a leader at the top level. But they stay because they like what they do in one area. They're so narrowly developed, they don't get that breadth of experience that you want across the board. So latter part of the last century, we began to emphasize this idea of experience. Now, the first problem you run into is how much experience can you give people? I mean, how many different jobs and moving them around and disruptive nature of doing that sort of thing. We learned how to do it vicariously. Certainly in the military we did. You know certainly if you haven't been in the military of field exercises, computer simulations, tabletop games, and actually other fields have gone into this. How can I create training environments, experiential environments that aren't real, they're temporary, but I can expose you to a variety of positions. So all this came into looking at leaders today. And what I found, and I'm going to go through the things that I thought were most significant about success and failure in leadership today, but what I found basically is that some of the traits that you would naturally think leaders should have, and certainly have demonstrated in the past, do carry over to today, but some of them should be emphasized or need to be emphasized more. And there are certain other kinds of traits or characteristics or applications to leadership that are unique to this new century.